The call came at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, the way these calls always did. Too early, too quiet, another name crossing from one list to another. Elena Vasquez set down her coffee and listened to the night nurse's voice, already knowing what she would hear before the words arrived. Mr. Hobbs passed about an hour ago, peaceful, in his sleep. Anyone with him? A pause that answered the question. No, I checked on him at 5 and he was breathing. By 6 he wasn't. Elena thanked her and hung up. She stood at her kitchen window, looking out at the Nevada desert, the first pink light of dawn touching the mountains east of town, and tried to feel something. After 18 years in hospice care, she'd learned to keep a certain distance. Professional, necessary, the only way to do this work without breaking. But Walter Hobbs had gotten under her skin in ways she still didn't understand. He'd been at the facility for 3 weeks, transferred from the VA hospital in Reno when it became clear that treatment was no longer the point. 74 years old, liver cancer, advanced, no family listed in his records, no emergency contacts. Just a faded military ID that said he'd served in Vietnam and a cardboard box of belongings that fit on a single shelf. Elena had taken extra shifts to sit with him. She told herself it was because the other nurses were overworked, because someone should be there, because dying alone was the one thing she couldn't make herself accept, no matter how many times she witnessed it. But the truth was simpler. Walter Hobbs had stories, and she'd wanted to hear them. He'd talked about the Mekong Delta in '68, about rice paddies and monsoons, and a village called Phu Loc, where he'd done something he never fully explained. He'd talked about coming home to an airport where people spat on his uniform, about the decades after, the drinking, the marriages that failed, the jobs that didn't last, the slow slide into the kind of invisibility that swallowed men whole. He'd talked about a brother he hadn't spoken to in 40 years, and a nephew who'd returned his last letter unopened. Doesn't matter now, he'd said, his voice thin as paper. You do enough wrong in one life, eventually people stop giving you chances. Can't blame them for that. Elena had wanted to argue, but she'd learned that dying men rarely wanted arguments. They wanted witnesses. So she'd sat with him and listened and held his hand when the pain got bad, and now he was gone and there was paperwork to file and a body to transport and a funeral to arrange that no one would attend. She drove to the facility through the empty morning streets of Hawthorne, past the ammunition depot that gave the town its only industry, past the diner and the gas station and the cemetery where the military headstones stood in perfect rows. Walter would be buried there, she supposed, assuming the VA processed the paperwork in time, a flag on his coffin, a bugle playing taps, the bare minimum of honor for a man who'd served his country and been forgotten by everyone else. Frank Delacroix was waiting for her at the facility, which surprised her. The funeral director usually didn't come himself for pickups. He had staff for that. But here he was, standing beside his vehicle in a dark suit that looked too formal for 6 in the morning. Heard about Hobbs, he said, by way of greeting. Thought I'd handle this one personally. You knew him. Not really, but I know his type. Frank was in his 60s, a quiet man with steady hands and a face that had seen everything twice. He'd run Delacroix Funeral Home for 30 years, and before that, he'd run a rifle in Khe Sanh. Vietnam, same years as me. Different unit, but we crossed paths once at a VFW in Reno, maybe 15 years back. He was already on his way down by then. I bought him a drink. We didn't talk much. He paused. Nobody's claimed the body? No next of kin we can reach. There's a nephew in California, but he hasn't returned calls. Frank's jaw tightened, so he goes to the county. Unless someone steps up. They both knew what that meant. A pauper's burial, a numbered marker. No service, no ceremony, no one standing over the grave to say the words that needed to be said. The VA would eventually send a headstone, but it would be months, and by then, Walter Hobbs would be nothing but a name in a file that no one opened. Let me make some calls, Frank said. I know people who care about this kind of thing. Elena nodded and went inside to begin the paperwork. Death certificate, personal effects inventory, the cold machinery of ending a life. Walter's belongings fit in a single cardboard box, clothes worn thin, a razor, a Bible with a cracked spine, a wallet containing $7 and a faded photograph of a Vietnamese woman holding an infant. At the bottom, wrapped in a handkerchief that might have once been white, was a medal. Elena held it up to the light, a bronze star. The ribbon faded, but the metal still bright. On the back, an inscription too small to read without her glasses. She found them, squinted at the words, "For Valor." Phulock Village, 1968, for valor. Walter had never mentioned that. He'd talked about Phulock like it was a wound, not an honor. What had he done there that earned him a medal he kept hidden at the bottom of a box? She set the medal aside and kept sorting. Beneath the handkerchief was an envelope, yellowed with age, addressed in careful handwriting to a Carl Whitmore in Fresno, California. The same nephew who wouldn't return calls. The envelope was sealed, never sent. Elena held it for a long moment, feeling the weight of words that had never reached their destination. Then she placed it back in the box and closed the lid. Outside, Frank was on his phone, his voice low and urgent. She caught fragments. No family. Vietnam vet, buried with honor. Before he noticed her and turned away, when he hung up, his face had settled into something that might have been hope. "I called a friend," he said, "man named Ghost Morrison. He runs with the Desert Riders, motorcycle club, mostly veterans. They do this sometimes, show up for funerals when no one else will. He's making calls." "When's the service?" "Thursday, 2 o'clock. County's giving us the slot." Frank looked at the box in Elena's hands. Anything in there worth knowing about? She thought about the medal, the photograph, the letter that had never been sent, the stories Walter had told her in the dark hours before dawn, stories she'd carried with her like stones in her pockets. "Maybe," she said. "I'm still figuring it out." Frank nodded and went to collect the body. Elena stood in the parking lot, watching the sun climb higher over the desert, and made a decision she couldn't quite explain. She would find Carl Whitmore. She would put that letter in his hands, and she would make sure that when Walter Hobbs was lowered into the ground, someone would be there who knew what kind of man he'd been, the good and the bad, the valor and the failure, the whole complicated truth of a life that deserved more than a numbered marker and a county-issued grave. It was probably too late to matter. But she was going to try anyway. Carl Whitmore wasn't hard to find. A few internet searches, a phone call to a former colleague at a hospice in Fresno, and Elena had an address in a subdivision on the east side of town, one of those planned communities with Spanish tile roofs and identical mailboxes and lawns that stayed green through sheer force of sprinklers. She drove there Wednesday morning, the unsealed letter in her purse, and no clear idea of what she would say when she arrived. The house was well kept, the kind of place that spoke of steady employment and careful attention to appearances. A minivan sat in the driveway. A plastic tricycle lay on its side near the garage. Carl Whitmore had built a life here, a family, a home, all the things his uncle had lost or never managed to hold on to. Elena rang the doorbell and waited. The man who answered was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with the broad shoulders of someone who'd done physical work before moving to a desk. He looked at her, the way people looked at strangers on their doorstep, wary, slightly annoyed, already preparing excuses. "Carl Whitmore? Who's asking?" "My name is Elena Vasquez. I was your uncle's hospice nurse." She watched his face close up, the wariness sharpening into something harder. "He passed away yesterday morning. I wanted you to know." Carl's expression didn't change. "I got the call from the facility. They left a message." "And you didn't call back?" "No." He didn't elaborate, didn't apologize, just stood there in his doorway with his arms crossed, a wall made of flesh and bone. Elena reached into her purse and pulled out the letter. "He wrote this to you. I found it in his things. It was never sent." Carl looked at the envelope like it might bite him. I want it. You haven't even read it." "I don't need to." His voice was flat, but there was something underneath it, a tremor, quickly suppressed. Whatever he had to say, it's 40 years too late. My mother spent her whole life waiting for him to show up, to be the brother he promised he'd be. He never did. He missed her funeral. He missed my graduation. He missed my wedding and the birth of my kids. Every time she reached out, he disappeared again. And when she died... Carl stopped, swallowed hard. "When she died, he sent a card. A card. 2 sentences and his name at the bottom. That's what her brother's grief looked like." Elena absorbed this. She'd known Walter had failures, had heard him speak of them in the vague, deflecting way men spoke of their worst mistakes, but hearing it from the other side, from the nephew who'd watched his mother wait and be disappointed over and over was different. He was sick, she said, not just at the end, his whole life. The war did something to him that he never figured out how to fix. That's not an excuse. No, it's not. She held out the letter again, but it might be an explanation, or at least his attempt at one. I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm asking you to read what he wrote. Carl stared at the envelope for a long moment. Behind him, somewhere in the house, a child laughed, a bright, uncomplicated sound that seemed to belong to a different world than the one they were standing in. The funeral, he said finally. When is it? Tomorrow, 2:00, Hawthorne, Nevada. That's 5 hours from here. I know. He took the letter, didn't open it, just held it in his hand, turning it over like he was weighing its contents through the paper. I'll think about it. It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a refusal either. Elena gave him the cemetery address and drove back to Hawthorne, with the desert scrolling past her windows and the weight of other people's grief pressing against her chest. That evening, she met Ghost Morrison at the diner on Main Street. He was waiting in a back booth when she arrived, a big man with a gray beard and tattoos that climbed his forearms like vines. His leather vest was worn soft with years, patches covering the chest and back. Desert Riders MC, the eagle and anchor insignia of the Marine Corps, a small American flag above his heart. He stood when she approached and shook her hand with the careful grip of someone who knew his own strength. Frank told me about Hobbs, he said, settling back into the booth. Said you were the one with him at the end, as close as anyone was. Elena ordered coffee and waited for it to arrive before continuing. He died alone. I was on my way in when it happened. Happens more than people know. Guys like him, Vietnam vets, the ones who fell through the cracks, they learn to be invisible. It's how they survive, but invisible means no one notices when you're gone. Ghost wrapped his hands around his own cup, steam rising between them. I've buried 12 of them in the past 3 years, all forgotten, all alone. It's why we started doing what we do. How many riders are you expecting? 40 confirmed, maybe more by tomorrow. Word spreads. He studied her face. Frank said there's a nephew. Any chance he shows? I don't know. I went to see him today. Gave him a letter Walter never sent. Elena shook her head. He's angry. Has a right to be, probably. Walter wasn't a good brother. Wasn't a good uncle. He knew it, too. Talked about it in those last weeks like he was trying to confess. He tell you what happened in Vietnam? The question landed differently than she expected. Not casual. Pointed. Like Ghost already knew there was something to tell. Some of it. He mentioned a village called Phu Loc. Said he did something there that he never... She stopped, remembering Walter's face when he'd talked about it, the way his eyes had gone somewhere else, somewhere she couldn't follow. He didn't finish, just said he'd been carrying it for 50 years and didn't know how to put it down. Ghost was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his vest and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. I did some digging after Frank called. Made some calls to guys I know at the VFW, guys who keep records. Found this. He slid the paper across the table. Elena unfolded it carefully. A newspaper clipping, the print faded but still legible. The headline read, Local Soldier Honored for Heroism in Vietnam. Below it, a photograph of a young man in uniform, Walter Hobbs, barely recognizable, his face unlined and his eyes still capable of hope. The article told a story Walter had never shared. Phu Loc Village, January 1968. A Viet Cong ambush that had killed half his squad. Walter, wounded himself, had carried 3 men to safety, through enemy fire, then gone back for a 4th. A Navy corpsman named David Reyes, who died in Walter's arms before the medevac arrived. He got the Bronze Star for that, Ghost said. Should have gotten more, but the paperwork got lost in the shuffle. Tet Offensive hit 2 weeks later, and everything went sideways. He tapped the article. The man he tried to save, Reyes, he had a family in San Diego, a wife and 2 kids. After the war, Walter tried to visit them, wanted to tell them what happened, how their husband and father died, but he couldn't do it. Sat in his car outside their house for 3 hours and drove away. Did that 4 times over the years, never knocked. Elena read the article again, piecing together the man she'd known with the man on the page. The valor, the failure. The decades of silence that had nothing to do with not caring and everything to do with caring too much and not knowing what to do with it. He punished himself, she said, for surviving. A lot of them did, still do. Ghost took back the clipping and folded it carefully. Doesn't excuse the people he hurt along the way, but it might explain some of it. His nephew doesn't want explanations. His nephew's grieving a mother who grieved her brother for 40 years. That's a lot of grief to carry. People do strange things with it. Ghost finished his coffee and signaled for the check. You did right, going to see him. Whatever happens tomorrow, at least you tried. Elena drove home through the dark desert, the stars sharp and bright above the empty road. Tomorrow, Walter Hobbs would be buried. Maybe 40 bikers would be there. Maybe his nephew would come. Maybe it would matter. Or maybe it was all just gestures made too late to change anything. She thought about the letter she'd given Carl, the words that Walter had written and never sent, the apology or explanation or whatever it contained. She hadn't read it, hadn't felt she had the right. But she wondered now what was in there. What could possibly be enough to bridge 40 years of silence? Her phone buzzed as she pulled into her driveway. A text from an unknown number. This is Carl Whitmore. I read the letter. I'll be there tomorrow. Elena sat in her car for a long time, looking at those words, feeling something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. One person, one family member, one witness who would stand at the grave not because of obligation or charity, but because of blood. It wasn't everything, but it was something. She went inside and set her alarm for 5 o'clock. Tomorrow was going to be a long day. Thursday morning came with a wind out of the west, hot and dry, carrying the smell of sage and dust across the desert. Elena arrived at the cemetery at noon, 2 hours before the service, and found Frank Delacroix already there, directing the placement of chairs near the open grave. County gave us 30 seats, he said, not looking up from his work. I ordered 60. Figured we'd need them. Ghost said 40 riders confirmed. Last I heard, it was closer to 70. Word keeps spreading. Frank straightened and wiped his brow. Had a call this morning from a VFW post in Reno. They're sending a color guard. And the American Legion in Carson City wants to do the rifle salute. Elena looked at the modest gravesite, the rectangle of desert earth, the plain county coffin, the single flower arrangement she'd paid for herself. In a few hours, this forgotten corner of a forgotten cemetery would be full of people who had never met Walter Hobbs, but understood what it meant to let a veteran be buried alone. Any word from Carl Whitmore? Frank asked. Just the text last night. He said he'd be here. 5-hour drive, long way to come for a man you're angry at. Maybe that's why he's coming, to put it to rest. Frank nodded and went back to arranging chairs. Elena walked through the cemetery, reading headstones, trying to quiet the anxiety that had been building since dawn. She'd done everything she could, found the nephew, rallied the riders, uncovered the truth about Phu Loc. Now all she could do was wait and hope it was enough. At 1:15, the first motorcycles arrived. They came down the access road in a loose formation, chrome glinting in the afternoon sun, engines rumbling low. Ghost was in the lead, his gray beard streaming over his shoulder. Behind him rode men and women of every age, young veterans with fresh tattoos and old ones with faded insignias, all of them wearing leather vests and the particular expression of people on a mission. They parked in rows along the cemetery fence, cutting their engines one by one until the silence returned. Then they dismounted, removed their helmets, and walked toward the gravesite in a quiet procession that needed no rehearsal. Elena counted as they came, 73 riders, more than she'd hoped for, more than Walter Hobbs had probably ever imagined. By 1:45, the color guard from Reno had arrived, 4 men in crisp uniforms, carrying flags that snapped in the desert wind. The American Legion rifle team set up near the fence, 7 veterans with silver hair and steady hands. A bugler in dress blues stood apart, his instrument gleaming, and still no sign of Carl Whitmore. Elena checked her phone. No new messages, no missed calls. She thought about texting him, but what would she say? Are you coming? He'd said he would be. Either he was on his way or he'd changed his mind, and either way, her asking wouldn't make a difference. At 1:55, a car appeared on the access road, not a motorcycle, but a silver sedan moving slowly through the dust. Elena felt her heart lift. But as the car drew closer, she realized it wasn't a minivan, wasn't Carl. The sedan parked near the motorcycles, and a woman stepped out. She was in her 60s, small and trim, with dark hair gone gray at the temples. She wore a simple black dress and carried a folded American flag against her chest, like she was protecting something precious. Elena didn't recognize her. Neither did Ghost, who had moved to stand beside her. "You know who that is?" he asked quietly. "No idea." The woman walked toward them, her steps careful on the uneven ground. As she got closer, Elena saw that her eyes were red, her face drawn with the particular exhaustion of grief that had been carried a long time. "I'm looking for the funeral of Walter Hobbs," she said. "Is this the right place?" "It is." Elena extended her hand. "I'm Elena Vasquez. I was Walter's hospice nurse. Did you know him?" The woman shook her hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "No, I never met him, but I knew someone he knew." She looked at the flag in her arms. "My name is Maria Reyes. David Reyes was my husband." Elena felt the ground shift beneath her feet. David Reyes, the corpsman who had died in Walter's arms at Phu Loc, the man whose family Walter had tried to visit 4 times and never could. "Mrs. Reyes, I got a call last night from a man named Ghost. He told me what happened, what Walter did for David, what he tried to do after." Maria's voice was steady, but there was a tremor underneath. "I've spent 55 years not knowing how my husband died. The army sent a letter, but it was just words. Killed in action. Died serving his country. Nothing about the moment. Nothing about who was with him." Ghost stepped forward. "I found her through the VA records. Figured she had a right to know." Maria looked at the grave, at the plain coffin waiting to be lowered into the earth. "I'm not here to forgive him. I don't know if there's anything to forgive, but I wanted to see—" She stopped, her composure cracking. "I wanted to see the man who held my David at the end, even if it's too late." Elena put her arm around the woman's shoulders, feeling the fragility beneath the black dress. 55 years, half a century of not knowing, and now, standing in a desert cemetery surrounded by strangers, finally learning the truth about a night in a Vietnamese village that had changed everything. The service was supposed to start in 3 minutes. The chairs were full. The color guard stood ready, and Carl Whitmore was nowhere to be seen. Elena made a decision. She couldn't wait any longer. Whatever was going to happen, it was time to begin. She walked to the front of the gathering and faced the crowd. 73 bikers, a dozen veterans from the VFW and Legion, Maria Reyes with her folded flag, Frank Delacroix with his steady undertaker's calm. The wind had died down, and the desert held its breath. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice carrying in the stillness. "Most of you didn't know Walter Hobbs. I barely knew him myself. 3 weeks in a hospice room, that's all we had. But in those 3 weeks, he told me things he'd never told anyone. About a war that broke him. About a life he couldn't figure out how to live. About the people he let down because he didn't know how to let them in." She looked at Maria, who was clutching her flag with white-knuckled hands. Walter earned a Bronze Star at a place called Phu Loc. He carried 3 wounded men to safety through enemy fire, then went back for a 4th, a Navy corpsman named David Reyes. David didn't make it. He died in Walter's arms, and Walter spent the next 50 years trying to figure out how to live with that. Elena paused. "He never did figure it out, but that doesn't mean his life was worthless. It means he was human, broken and brave and flawed and trying, like all of us." A murmur went through the crowd. The color guard raised their flags. The bugler lifted his instrument. And then, from the access road, came the sound of a car door slamming. Elena turned. A minivan had parked at the edge of the lot, and a man was walking toward them, Carl Whitmore, his tie loosened, his face tight with emotion. He was carrying something in his hand, a piece of paper, folded and worn. He stopped at the edge of the gathering, breathing hard, like he'd run instead of driven. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said. "Traffic through Tonopah." He looked at Elena, then at the coffin, then at the rows of bikers who had parted to let him through. "I didn't know about any of this, the riders, His voice broke. "My mother never told me. She never knew. All those years she thought he didn't care, and he was drowning," Elena said quietly, "and he didn't know how to ask for help." Carl walked to the graveside, unfolding the letter as he went. He stood there for a long moment, looking down at the coffin, and then he began to read. Dear Carl, I've started this letter 100 times and never finished it. I don't know how to say what I need to say, so I'm just going to say it plain. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I wasn't there for your mother. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you. I'm sorry I let the war eat me alive and spit out someone who couldn't be what you needed. His voice grew steadier as he read, the words as Walter had written, filling the desert air. There was a man in Vietnam. His name was David Reyes. He died trying to save other people, and I couldn't save him. I've been carrying that ever since. It's not an excuse. It's just the truth. Some wounds don't heal. You just learn to bleed quieter. But I should have told you. I should have told your mother. I should have said something instead of nothing, even if the something wasn't enough. Carl's voice cracked on the final words. I love you, nephew. I always did. I just didn't know how to show it. Maybe this letter won't change anything. Maybe you'll throw it away. But at least you'll know I tried. In the end, I tried. Uncle Walter. He folded the letter and placed it on the coffin. Then he stepped back, and the rifles cracked, and the bugle played taps, and Walter Hobbs was lowered into the ground, surrounded by 73 strangers who had become, in that moment, something like family. Maria Reyes stepped forward and placed her folded flag on the grave. For David, she said softly, and for the man who tried to bring him home. The desert wind picked up again, carrying dust across the headstones, and Elena stood among the bikers and veterans and mourners, watching the dirt fall on a man who had been forgotten by the world, but remembered, in the end, by the people who mattered. The crowd didn't disperse after the burial. They lingered near the gravesite, talking in small groups, sharing cigarettes and stories, and the particular silence of people who understood what had just happened. The color guard folded their flags with practiced precision. The rifle team packed their weapons. The bugler stood alone near the fence, looking out at the desert like he was waiting for something he couldn't name. Elena found herself standing between Carl and Maria Reyes, the three of them forming a small island in the sea of leather vests and gray beards. Neither of them had spoken since the service ended. Neither seemed to know what to say. I didn't know, Carl said finally, his voice hoarse, about your husband, about any of it. My mother, she just said, Uncle Walter came back from the war different, broken. She never knew why. Maria nodded slowly. The army didn't tell me much either, just that David was killed in an ambush, that he was a hero. She looked at the fresh grave, the dirt still mounded and raw. I used to imagine what his last moments were like, whether he was scared, whether he was alone. For 55 years I imagined the worst things. A thin smile crossed her face. Now I know he wasn't alone. Someone was holding him. Someone tried to save him. And spent the rest of his life punishing himself for failing, Elena said quietly. Yes. Maria turned to face her. But he didn't fail, not really. He carried David as far as he could. He just couldn't carry him all the way home. She reached out and touched Elena's arm. You did that. You and that man, Ghost. You brought my David story back to me after all these years. That's not nothing. Ghost had approached without any of them noticing, moving quiet for a man his size, the way veterans learn to move. He stood at the edge of their circle, his face unreadable. Mrs. Reyes, he said, I hope it was okay that I called you. I wasn't sure if you'd want to know. I've been waiting 55 years to know. Maria straightened her shoulders, some of the fragility leaving her posture. My children grew up without their father. My grandchildren never met him. All they have are stories and photographs. Now they'll have this too, the truth about how he died and who was with him. She looked at the grave again. I'm glad I came. I'm glad I got to say goodbye to both of them. The crowd was beginning to thin now, riders drifting back toward their bikes, engines coughing to life one by one. But a small group had gathered near Frank Delacroix's car, and Elena noticed he was handing out something. Papers, it looked like. Photocopies of the old newspaper article Ghost had found. What's that about? She asked. Frank's idea, Ghost said. Figured people should know the whole story. Walter Hobbs wasn't just another forgotten vet. He was a hero who couldn't live with what that cost him. That's worth remembering. Carl had been quiet, still staring at the grave like he was having a conversation with it that no one else could hear. Now he turned to Elena, his eyes red but his face steadier than it had been. "The letter," he said. "There was more. Things I didn't read out loud. You don't have to tell me. I want to." He pulled the worn paper from his pocket and unfolded it carefully. "He wrote about my mother, about how she was the only person who never gave up on him, even when she should have. He said she was the best of their family, and he was the worst, and he spent his whole life proving both things true." Carl's voice caught. "He said he used to drive past our house sometimes, when I was a kid. He'd park down the street and watch me ride my bike or play in the yard. He wanted to come inside. He just couldn't." Elena thought about Walter in those final weeks, the stories he'd told, the silences between them, the way he'd sometimes stare at the wall like he was watching a movie only he could see. He'd been living with ghosts for 50 years. His whole life had been a haunted house, and he'd never found the way out. "There's something else," she said. She hadn't planned to mention it, hadn't been sure it was her place, but standing here with Carl and Maria, watching the grave fill in, it felt right. In Walter's belongings, there was a photograph, a Vietnamese woman holding an infant. Ghost's expression sharpened. "You still have it?" "It's at the funeral home, with the rest of his effects." Elena looked at Carl. "I don't know who she is. He never mentioned her. But the photograph was worn, like he'd looked at it a lot, carried it a long time." Carl was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Let me see it." They drove to Delacroix Funeral Home in a small convoy. Elena's car, Carl's minivan, Ghost on his Harley. Frank was waiting for them, as if he'd known they would come, and he led them to the back room where Walter's cardboard box still sat on its shelf. Elena lifted out the photograph and handed it to Carl. He studied it in the dim light, turning it over, looking for a name or a date or any clue to who this woman was. "No writing," he said. "Nothing on the back." "Could be anyone," Ghost said. "A lot of guys had local girlfriends in country. It didn't always mean anything. But sometimes it did." Maria had come with them, her flag still folded in her arms, and she leaned in to look at the photograph. "She's young, pretty, and that baby, it could be his. Look at the eyes." Elena looked. The photograph was faded, the colors washed out by time, but the woman's face was clear, delicate features, dark hair pulled back, an expression caught somewhere between hope and fear. The infant in her arms was maybe 6 months old, looking at the camera with the unfocused curiosity of babies everywhere. The eyes. Elena hadn't noticed before, but Maria was right. They were lighter than the mother's. A mix of something. "If he had a child over there," Carl began. "Then that child would be in their 50s now," Ghost finished, "with kids of their own, maybe, grandkids." He took the photograph from Carl and studied it himself. "There are organizations that track this kind of thing. Children of American servicemen born in Vietnam. A lot of them were left behind after the war. Some made it to the States, some didn't." Carl stared at the photograph like it had just rewritten everything he knew about his family. "I might have a cousin. A whole branch of the family I never knew existed." "You might." Ghost handed back the photograph. "Or this could be nothing. Just a woman he knew, a memory he carried. We might never know for sure. But we could try to find out." Carl looked at Elena. "You said he told you stories. Did he ever mention—" "No, he never talked about anything like this." Elena thought back to those long nights in the hospice room, Walter's voice drifting through the darkness. He'd talked about the war, about the men he'd served with, about David Reyes and Phu Loc, but he'd never mentioned a woman, never mentioned a child. If there's a story there, he took it with him. The room was quiet. Through the window, Elena could see the last of the riders pulling out of the parking lot, their engines fading into the desert afternoon. The funeral was over. Walter Hobbs was in the ground, but somehow, in the space of a single day, his death had opened doors that his life had kept closed. "I need to think about this," Carl said finally. He tucked the photograph into his pocket alongside the letter. "It's a lot. My mother, if she'd known—" He shook his head. "I don't know what she would have done. I don't know what I'm supposed to do." "You don't have to do anything," Maria said gently. "Not today. Today you just buried your uncle. That's enough for one day." Carl looked at her, this woman he'd met an hour ago, connected to him through a thread of grief that stretched back half a century. "Thank you," he said, "for coming, for what you said at the grave. I know it couldn't have been easy. Nothing about this has been easy, for any of us. Maria smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. But that doesn't mean it wasn't worth doing. They walked outside together into the late afternoon sun. Ghost's bike sat alone now, chrome gleaming in the light. The parking lot was empty except for their vehicles and the quiet presence of the funeral home, waiting for its next purpose. I should head back, Carl said. It's a long drive. My wife will be worried. Call her, Elena said. Let her know you're okay. I will. He hesitated, then pulled Elena into an awkward hug. Thank you for finding me, for making me read that letter, for... His voice broke. For not letting him be forgotten. Elena held him for a moment, this stranger who had become something else over the course of 2 days. He wasn't forgotten, she said, not by the people who mattered. Carl got in his minivan and drove away, the photograph and the letter in his pocket, carrying pieces of Walter Hobbs back to a family that had finally learned the truth. Maria Reyes left next, heading south toward San Diego, toward children and grandchildren who would hear a story tonight that would change the shape of their history. And Elena stood in the parking lot with Ghost, watching the sun sink toward the mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and rust. Hell of a day, Ghost said. Hell of a day, she agreed. You did good, Elena. Most people wouldn't have tried. They would have just signed the paperwork and moved on. I couldn't. She thought about Walter in his hospice bed, his thin voice filling the darkness with stories he'd carried alone for too long. He deserved better than what he got from life. At least he could have better in death. Ghost nodded and swung onto his bike. You ever need anything, you call. Desert riders don't forget the people who stand up for the forgotten. I'll remember that. He kicked the engine to life, raised a hand in farewell, and rode off into the fading light. Elena stood there for a long time after he was gone, watching the dust settle on the road that led out of town. Then she got in her car and drove home, through the desert that had witnessed everything and would remember none of it, past the cemetery where Walter Hobbs lay beneath the earth, finally at rest. 6 months later, the headstone arrived. Elena drove out to the cemetery on a Saturday morning in April, when the desert was blooming with wildflowers and the heat hadn't yet turned brutal. The VA had finally processed the paperwork. Walter Hobbs, Corporal, United States Army, Vietnam, 1969, Bronze Star. The stone was simple granite, regulation size, nothing that would stand out from the rows of identical markers around it, but someone had added a small bronze plaque at the base, and when Elena crouched down to read it, she felt her throat tighten, remembered by the Desert Riders MC. No veteran dies alone. Ghost's doing, she suspected, or maybe Frank Delacroix, or maybe both of them together, refusing to let Walter fade into the anonymity of a county cemetery. She ran her fingers over the words and thought about the 73 riders who had filled this space on a Thursday afternoon, the rifles cracking in salute, the bugle playing taps for a man none of them had known. She'd kept in touch with some of them. Ghost called every few weeks to check in, his gruff voice a strange comfort on the long nights when the hospice work got heavy. Frank had started referring families to the Desert Riders when veterans died without anyone to mourn them. 3 more funerals in the past 6 months, each one attended by a convoy of bikes and the particular silence of people who understood what they were doing and why it mattered. It had become a thing, Elena realized, a tradition. Walter Hobbs had been the forgotten veteran whose funeral had no guests, and now there was a network of riders making sure it never happened that way again. Carl Whitmore had called her in January with news. He'd hired a researcher, someone who specialized in tracing the children of American servicemen born in Vietnam. It had taken months of digging through military records, refugee databases, immigration files from the chaos of 1975, but they'd found her. Nguyen Thi Mai, the woman in the photograph. She had died in 1982 in a refugee camp in Thailand, still trying to get to America. But her daughter, Walter's daughter, confirmed through DNA testing with Carl, had made it. She'd been adopted by a family in Minnesota, raised as Lisa Chen, and was now 53 years old with 2 children of her own. I called her last week, Carl had said, his voice thick with emotion. Told her who her father was, what he did in the war, why he never came for her. How did she take it? She cried, Asked a lot of questions I couldn't answer. Then she asked if she could visit his grave. A pause. She's coming out in March. I'm going to meet her there. Introduce her to the family she never knew she had. Elena had cried too, after she hung up. Sitting in her kitchen with the Nevada dawn breaking over the mountains, thinking about Walter Hobbs and the daughter he'd never met and the letter he'd never sent. He'd spent 50 years carrying guilt he couldn't put down, and in the end, his death had done what his life couldn't, brought the broken pieces of his family back together. It wasn't a happy ending. Happy endings were for stories where nobody died too young or too alone, where fathers found their children and wounds healed without scars. This was something else, something more complicated, a bittersweet resolution that acknowledged the damage while still finding grace in the wreckage. Maria Reyes had written Elena a letter, handwritten on paper so thin it felt like holding a whisper. She'd told her grandchildren about David, about Phu Loc, about the man who had tried to carry him home. They'd added a line to David's headstone in San Diego, held by a brother at the end. It wasn't much, but it was something that hadn't existed before, a thread connecting two families across half a century of silence. Elena visited Walter's grave once a month now. She didn't know why exactly. He was gone, and the dead didn't need company. But she found herself drawn back to this quiet corner of the cemetery, this patch of desert earth where something had happened that felt larger than any of them. She would stand there for a few minutes, say a few words, then drive back to town and get on with her life. The hospice work continued. The calls still came at 6:47 in the morning, the way they always did. She still sat with the dying, held their hands, listened to their stories. But something had shifted in her, some understanding that hadn't been there before. Every patient had a Walter Hobbs buried inside them, a story they'd never told, a letter they'd never sent, a wound they'd carried so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to be whole. Her job wasn't to heal them, it was to witness, to make sure that when they left this world, someone knew they had been here. She was thinking about this when her phone buzzed with a text from Ghost. Got another one. Veteran in Tonopah, no family. Funeral's Tuesday. You in? Elena looked out her window at the desert, the mountains purple in the distance, the sky, that impossible Nevada blue that made you believe the world was bigger than your problems. She typed back, I'm in. Then she poured her coffee, pulled on her coat, and drove to work. The sun was just rising over the ammunition depot when she arrived at the hospice facility. Another day, another chance to be the person standing beside someone who had no one else. Another opportunity to make sure that when the end came, it didn't come alone. It wasn't much, but it was enough. If this story moved you, subscribe so you never miss one. And tell us in the comments, how do you honor those who've been forgotten? We read every response.